Ready, Set, Engage, episode 24. Today I wanted to talk about socialism versus democratic socialism, and we'll kind of go through. I've got a whole bunch of notes for this. This might be a little bit of a longer one, and then after this I'll actually change the format a little bit. I want to work on showing critical thinking as opposed to, or critical reading as well, as opposed to just me rambling about my views for so long. The conversation related to socialism versus democratic socialism kind of kicked off because there was a post by Business Insider, and of course it tells me that I'm using an ad blocker, which I am. 49 ads on this page. So there's this thing that says, oh God, what is this? That says, what's the difference between socialism and democratic socialism? And then it sort of has this thing, and if you read it, it basically says democratic socialism includes democratic principles, and thus it's totally different, right? And because it includes the word democracy or democratic, then obviously it's not socialism, which is an interesting concept. I'll include the link later. But basically it says, hey, democratic socialism is not just socialism, so we shouldn't be scared because socialism is definitely scarier. And somewhere it even calls out that socialism is known as being scary or bad, right? It's got a negative connotation to it, and so it already sort of knows. And so I read it and I kind of giggled, and I thought to myself that having an article like that is awesome and almost hilarious if it's not so sad. It reminds me of Ice Ice Baby. When Ice Ice Baby came out, there was actually a video of Vanilla Ice doing an interview. I want to say it was on MTV, and he says yeah, my song didn't take anything from Under Pressure because their beat, right? Well, we sampled and sampling's normal, but ours is totally different. Theirs goes da 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 da, and mine goes da 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 da, and that little it's different. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely different. In fact, it means it's heavily sampled. Which, okay, sure, rap artists sample, I get it. So it gave me a little bit of laugh. The thing about socialism is it sort of has a positive connotation right now, or democratic socialism sort of has a positive connotation right now. But historically, again, over the last 150 years, it really wasn't that way. So I watched two movies over the last couple weeks and wanted to sort of talk about both of them a little bit. The first is I watched Downfall. It came out in 2004, and if you're familiar with memes at all, there's a series of memes related to people give Hitler bad news, basically, and that's from the movie Downfall, right? And so he gets excited and he's yelling at his like all of his party leaders or whatever in his office, and then he says, oh, but these three guys can go, and then he just like flips out. And so it's like they tell Hitler that PlayStation is not going to be on sale this year or something like that, and then he wigs out. It's very funny. The movie Downfall, though, is about the last, I think it's the last 72 hours inside Hitler's bunker. Interesting movie. I kind of begrudged watching it because I'm not really that interested in knowing more about Hitler, but I guess it's important to do so. One of the things that I did notice when I was watching it is the dubbing. The dubbing for the movie at the bottom, they actually call out the party, and it's the National Socialist Party. So Hitler was a socialist, National Socialist, but he was the National Socialist German Workers' Party is the Nazi party. That's actually the name. So when we're talking about whether the left or the right is socialist, it seems like the left and its current ideas with democratic socialism, etc., is closer to a socialist party, although maybe not nationalistic because they believe in a lot of immigration and whatever. But socialism was a view of the Nazi party. So there's that for you. I'll have a link to history.com that talks about the Nazi Party and how their naming convention worked. When you talk about redid the or redid the education department in Germany, and some of those policies lasted up until the 1970s. It's really hard to get that out of the I think it was the history page, but at the end of the day, yeah, it's socialism. So that's fine. The second movie I wanted to talk about is actually 1984, and so 1984 is based on the book written by George Orwell. George Orwell, of course, died in 1949. He had tuberculosis. He was alive during that era, though, I think late 1800s to 1949. And that's interesting because if right now you sort of try and look up who George Orwell is, I don't know if it's on his Wikipedia page, but it classes him as a democratic socialist, right? George Orwell is a democratic socialist. So 1984 was a warning about socialism versus democratic socialism. No, wrong. Okay? So in 1936, you have to understand that the prevailing sort of train of thought of the intellectuals of society was that socialism and Marxism were good ideas, and that's why there was sort of this following that happened. Realistically, the U.S. wasn't probably that far from landing in a socialist sort of frame of mind as well. We were working very closely with the Nazis, or the Germans rather, on fields like eugenics and a lot of science. Ziggy? And so, like, democratic socialism, okay, it was a prevailing school of thought in the 1930s. And then he wrote Animal Farm. Animal Farm is basically people get a little bit of power and then they decide that they need to preserve their power, and so the ruling class or the bourgeoisie winds up protecting their power and sort of crushing the hopes of everyone else. Like the whole idea of socialism only works out if everyone sort of goes along with it. Once people in power decide that they could get more power by sort of indexing on their power and removing property possessions and rights from other people, then all of a sudden they're trying to preserve their power. So 1984 is a book that he wrote. The movie 1984 actually came out in 1985, fun fact. But it's actually really good. Like, it's very concerning when you look at the sort of the modern landscape. But it's actually a very good movie. Because it covers the book and sort of covers a lot of the paradigms. It shows a lot of the paradigms from the book. And it does a pretty good job of it as well. So, so this is sort of one of those things, right? The movie 1984. I'm gonna spoil it a little bit. It's been out for 40 years, so 30 years. So if you haven't watched it yet, maybe you'll watch it after this. It's still incredibly good. But basically, what happens is there's this government, and it's called Oceania. And Oceania has three castes of people. There's the inner party, the outer party, and then the proletariat. Now, proletariat is roughly 85% of the population, and it's basically the working class, the uneducated, the deplorables, whatever the hell you want to call them, right? 85% of this society is the proletariat, and the proletariat doesn't have a ton of goods to themselves. They don't have a lot of money. They're basically all poor. And so there's them. Then the outer party is like the middle class of this society, and the outer party is responsible for leading the workers' unions, and so there's a number of committees and committee meetings that's referenced in the movie. They're also responsible for controlling the media, okay? So the protagonist in this is Winston Smith, I believe, which is supposed to be based off of Winston Churchill loosely. I don't know. That's the thing I read in the Wikipedia, so I don't know how much I believe that. I'll give it to him. His name. And he's responsible for controlling what's in the papers, okay? Basically, the propaganda, okay? And so, one of the famous examples, or one of the examples that sort of recurrent throughout the thing is one, the place is always at war. It has to be at war because when you're at war, you can deprive rights and deprive resources, and everyone focuses on the war like you have something to unite people despite their lack of understanding of what's actually happening. But so the propaganda for NewSpeak, basically in the movie, they reduce rations, okay, and I believe it's 25 grams of chocolate down from 30. Okay, so he reads it and he's like, no, we can't frame it that way. Are you kidding me? People would riot and be crazy pissed, and this is no. And so he changes it, rewrites it, and it's like rations for chocolate have been increased from 20 grams to 25 grams. And then everyone's celebrating, and it shows them like, yeah, can you believe they're giving us more chocolate? Knowing, well, they could have or should have known that it was 30 and now it's 25, and so it should be one of those things where you're able to sort of see that differentiation if you're paying enough attention. But because they sold it as 20 to 25, everyone got excited and everyone united behind it. This is what's known as NewSpeak. So you take a fact, right, 25 grams out of the thing, and then you spin the narrative. And it's very fun when you think about it. And the reason I say it's very fun, there's actually... Let me figure out where it's at. So, it's this one. And then we'll do this. So, George Orwell's 1984, suddenly a bestseller. This came out, and basically what had happened is this lady, Kellyanne Conway, had used the term alternative facts, which people took as a reference to NewSpeak, okay? And that's interesting because there were a number of times during the campaign that this was a theme that came out, right? Talking about half-empty Trump rallies and et cetera. But NewSpeak, or alternative facts, wound up being something of a reference to 1984. And so a bunch of people went out and bought this book. That's great. However, they think that this book supports democratic socialism or the leftist ideologies. And I don't think that that's the case. So that gave me a little bit of a giggle when you talk about NewSpeak. Basically, you talk about reading an article and there will be a number of facts, but they've drastically twisted and changed those facts. I believe this is basically where you come up with fake news. And so that's part of the reason why I want to change the conversation in these videos to be more about how to read and how to apply logic to what you're reading, or how I go about reading, good, bad, or indifferent, right or wrong. And so the leading class in the book 1984 is INGSOC, INGSOC, and INGSOC is English Socialism. So basically, this book is about the dangers and the perils of socialism. The inner party winds up being the oligarchy, or the group that's controlling the government. You don't really see them, you don't really hear them. But political thinking is, there's thought police, and you are, if you think or say something against the government, then you are put on trial. You have to admit that you're a traitor, and then they kill you. The thing about this is there's actually a book. So in the movie, he goes and he talks to somebody from the inner party, and he's supposed to get a new book on the lexicon for NewSpeak edition 10 or something like that, right? Like how to control propaganda, and it's the 10th edition. And so he goes to talk with this guy. This guy gives him a book, and it's the 10th edition, but the pages are glued together. And when he pulls the pages apart, it winds up being the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism. Okay. And so in that, it's basically talking about how to take and apply socialism and maintain your power. The chapter 1 is ignorance is peace, and it talks about, or ignorance is strength, excuse me, and it talks about how to remove history, and thus the proletariat don't know what has happened in the past. They only know what's current, and that's the news and the propaganda that you're feeding them, and thus they can no longer project or understand what will happen in the future. So ignorance is strength. Basically, it says something along the lines of animals and proletariat, or the proles, are the only ones at peace in this world. Something along that line. the slogan of the party is who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. So people now in charge can remove history. And it's interesting when you talk about removing history. I've talked about this before in that the desire to remove a statue of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee wasn't actually big in support of slave ownership. In fact, he was one of the last generals to join in the Civil War. He had a number of slaves. He had 8 slaves, but they were inherited, and he only had them for 6 or 8 years, and then he actually released them prior to the Civil War. He after the Civil War, he was also responsible for helping the Union and the Confederates basically create a standing government again. He was in support of the government, and so when you talk about how bad of a person Robert E. Lee was, you really have to understand a bit of the larger context of what he did. But it's okay. We'll take down a statue because he owned 8 slaves. It doesn't make any sense, and this is why it's so dangerous right now that we're removing history. I won't spend too long getting into too many examples there. But the chapter 3 is war is peace. Okay, so there's no chapter 2. He's sort of flipping through, and it only shows him read a couple of parts. This is the same as what's in the book. War is peace, and basically what this says is when you're at war, or people believe you're at war, you're able to remove more liberties and thus control what's going on in the population. Basically, by being at war, you can remove rights, and everyone focuses on the enemy of the state as opposed to the infringement upon their rights. This is incredibly poignant today, and so assuming, well, no, I'm going to get through everything I have notes for. But at the end of this, we should talk about Ukraine, because Ukraine and the Soviet Union, or Russia, excuse me, are having an issue right now because Ukraine sort of strolled through a Russian channel that was part of the seizure of Crimea. So there's that. But the main port of that area and the bridge is actually owned by Russia now. They have a treaty signed in 2003 that basically says, hey, when you're going through there, it's a highly controlled area. I'll get to that later. But the point is they're leaning towards war with Russia, or an ideological war with Russia, which we'll talk about when we talk about news. So war is peace. The idea is if you have a war, then you're able to remove rights. And so in the movie, there's this very poignant piece at the end where basically Winston calls out, he doesn't know who they're at war with, because it was EurAsia, and then it was EastAsia for a while, and possibly it's Oceania. Like basically the news, because it's controlling the narrative, it actually changed who they were at war with midpoint through the movie. And if you were listening, you might have caught it and been like, wow, that's kind of weird that they just changed the name. But if you pay attention to sort of the lesson of the book, it's an important piece, because basically what it's saying is the person you're at war with, or the enemy that you're at war with, doesn't necessarily matter. The point is that you're at war, and because you're at war, you can start ceding rights away from the people. So a very poignant movie. One of the other things that's very interesting to me, especially as we're in this this highly modern electronic age, is in the movie they have telescreens, and a telescreen is basically a TV, but it's got like a little camera, and you don't get this at first, because at first it's just sort of broadcasting to them, but shortly therein it shows that the telescreen is monitoring them, and then there's a dialogue that happens with the telescreen. They like make him work out in his room and like monitor his progress as he's doing it. And so the point is, Big Brother is always watching you. Big Brother is the inner party of the of 1984. Okay, so they say big and all that. It's Big Brother. So that's fascinating, because when you talk about right now, when you talk about our society, there's actually more and more sort of two-way devices that are being installed in people's homes. You might look at a cell phone and know that if you're using Messenger It's probably listening to you for ad purposes, right? So as you talk, if Messenger's on your phone, you're likely to see advertisements for stuff you were talking about. Like, that's somewhat benign. There's probably some cloud compute that happens that changes what you're saying into small clips of interest and use those interests for AdSense or to produce advertisements. Is it bad? Is it government monitoring? No, not necessarily, or not that I'm aware of at this point. It's just interesting that we have allowed so many communication devices into our house that have these capabilities. If you were paying attention to the news, maybe last year, I think it was found that I believe it was Android devices had spyware basically from the Chinese government that were installed on it's either 1 million or 11 million devices, like quite a few devices. And so that was upsetting to folks because now China's spying on you. Well, ironically, we're inviting a lot of that into our homes. So that's the New York Times, like telling people, hey, go read George Orwell. George Orwell is, talking against the tyranny of Donald Trump, and it's not actually correct. I'll post a video again. I've talked about it a number of times that talks about the types of governments and explains them, right? And I thought it was from PragerU. Apparently it's from some other one. But basically it says that democracy never exists as for long as a governmental organization. That's why we're a republic and we're based on laws, right? So when you talk about conservative or Republican policy, it's generally like have the laws that allow you to have less organizations and less governmental control on everything, like less governmental bodies, less big government, etc. Keep it small, keep it lean, and keep it based on the rule of law. So it basically just says democracy is not a form of stable government, and that can be tracked all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans, and it always sort of translates or transforms into an oligarchy, and then oligarchies are eventually overthrown. Oligarchy being tyranny by the elite or a small ruling class. I guess that's my big stuff on socialism. I did have something for controlling the narrative, and a guy named James Fetzer. He's a professor, I want to say, at University of Montana. He's often on all the conspiracy things. If you're interested, look him up. So election fraud. It's kind of a good topic. There was a Twitter comment a couple weeks ago. Can I just hit F2 now? Yeah. Twitter comment a couple weeks ago. There was this one, and there's another one that basically says, hey, Broward County, we're going to be coming and looking at you and see if there's any election fraud. And the political left was like, oh, yeah, he's calling out election fraud, like he cares, blah, 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 and Russia. Well, the interesting thing is, if you look a little bit deeper, you can find that Brenda Snipes, this was the Board of Elections supervisor or whatever, she's actually been charged a number of times with election fraud or election meddling, something along that lines. They were basically like deleting ballots. I believe this is the state and federal law by destroying ballots in the 2016 primary election too early. So she's already sort of been tried and convicted for election meddling. Ironically, if we talk about more Democrats and election fraud, we can go and look at Bridgeport State Representative Christina Ayala. Now, this is an older article, mind you, so it popped up because somebody was sharing it on the Facebook. So I went and looked for a little more information on Christina Ayala. New Haven Register is sort of a local paper, and so it's less updated or controlled of a narrative. And of course, it talks about her going to different districts. I think she voted in like 16 different districts and was charged with it. Yeah. So election fraud seems to be happening on the left, whether you want to believe it or not. It is there. And of course, the media is like, oh, I can't believe Donald Trump's claiming election fraud on the left. And I think Broward County came in with like 41,000 Democratic votes with no conservative votes in the mail-in or the follow-up, which if you ever wind up with 100% confirmation of a side in any sort of discourse, then there's probably something wrong with it. You should be looking into it. So that's what I wanted to include there. Again, I'll put the links. I'll edit the name of the post and then include all the links there. Climate change. Oh, that's funny. BBC World was Ukraine. Okay, so Ukraine. Ukraine is very interesting because there's this article that's going around today, and basically, again, there's a strait, and it's in the Assos Bridge or something like that. It's between the Black Sea and somewhere else. And when you read through it, it's basically, hey, Russia's like attacking Ukraine again. They've seized 2 ships and a tugboat, and voted in favor. Yeah. And so this was on Sunday. The Sea of Azov and the Black Sea port of Odessa, like it was transiting between those two places. There's a bridge that happens that was part of the Kerch area. So Kerch controls this sealet, and this is the only pass between them. And basically what happens based on this 2003 treaty is that when they go through, they have to announce where they're going, what they're doing, how long they're going to be there, and ask permission. Okay, and so if you read these, it's very, very fascinating, because there's this, right? And so BBC, I'm going to say that BBC is slightly on the left in this position. It said it had informed the Russians in advance of its plan to move its ships to Mariupol, a claim denied by the Russians. So it notified them in advance, which means I sent you warning, roughly translated. It doesn't necessarily mean was granted passage or was approved to transit the sea. So I'm trying to look through here and I don't see it. We're going to go over to RT.com. RT.com it is actually a really interesting a news source. RT is Russian television or something like that, and so obviously it's going to be a bit biased. I think there was an article 4 or 5 years ago where one of their people was in the U.S. and started saying questionable stuff about Russia, and then was removed from the air or whatever. I don't get into too much of it. It's just a news source that I'll look at from time to time. So 2003 treaty, there are detailed technical rules on how vessels should pass through the complex waterway. It's all controlled here, and here's the stuff you need to do. Every ship should contact the facility, report the route and destination, and receive permission to sail through the strait. Now, what does the BBC not say? It said it gave notification in advance, not it received permission. So effectively, 3 ships from Ukraine seem to not have had permission, according to any article I've read, and they go to pass through this strait. There are 2 gunships and a tugboat, and I believe there's actually a video on this page. Also, I'll include this page as well. Video on this page that shows them sort of cutting in front of a Russian vessel, and they're really not that far off the bow, and so now all of a sudden you have aggressive maneuvering, I think is how it titles it in this video. Now the video is edited, so I don't know the full story. All I have is what these 2 news sources are showing me. But the thing that both are saying is that there was advanced warning or whatever that the ships were going to come through. And then this, of course, covers that Russia tried to contact them, tried to wave them off, and then eventually had to ram them. Okay. And so the other thing the BBC calls out is the UN Security Council did an emergency thing on Sunday night. And in here, it calls out that Russia actually requested the Security Council to come together for the Sunday meeting. So it's not like they were coming together to talk against Russia. Russia actually requested it, which is a detail that is neatly edited out of the BBC articles and not covered. And so this is Russia's statement, and it basically says, Ukraine stages a provocation, then plays power games and accuses Russia of aggression, which seems to be, that bridge is a navigation hazard. It would probably have to come down. Jeez. Which seems to be what's going on. The other thing to note, though, the other thing that's very interesting, and so it's covered a little bit inside of this and the other one, national security, convene emergency meeting, propose martial law. So basically what happened is Ukraine comes in through this strait. Ukraine doesn't follow the ordinances of that 2003 treaty. Russia reacts, like they not only got airplanes up in the air, they also had interdiction boats on both sides of the bridge, I believe. They take control of those boats, and then they drive them into the port, which is the Kerch. I think is the name of the port. They drive them into that port, and that's where they're at currently. Okay, and then what Ukraine does is its president, who might not be revoted into power come next year. Their election is supposed to be March 31st, and there's already talks that this instantiation of martial law may delay or mess up that election cycle. So there's already sort of this warning that something may happen with the election based on this. They declared martial law, and according to the BBC, 276 of whoever lawmakers voted in favor of martial law. So now they're in martial law. Martial law grants additional powers to the government. Well, who is the government, right? This Poroshenko guy, he's in power. Poroshenko's in power. Okay, that's interesting. So what can we find on Poroshenko? Well, if we look up Petro Poroshenko, fifth and current president, Ukraine, blah, blah, blah. He served. Here's all these stations he had. What political party is he? Oh, a Social Democrat. That's interesting because a lot of the news we've seen lately talks about Social Democrats, doesn't it? Not just socialism and social democracy are different, but there was also a thing 2 or 3 weeks ago where everyone was excited about the Brazilian election. Why was the Brazilian election interesting? Well, because the Socialist Democrat that was in office actually got impeached back in like March of this year. And then they voted in somebody that's a lot more nationalist and sounds more closer to what you would expect from Donald Trump. And so the news was all up in arms about this. So basically, when Social Democrats lose, the U.S. hears about it and the world hears about it. When they're set to possibly lose, it's this big thing, and oh my gosh, Russia is doing this to these people. Maybe. I don't know, right? Like, I just started reading this morning. So Petro Poroshenko, political party, Social Democrat. It's interesting, especially when I think of Social Democrats lately. I feel like a lot of them wind up being related or in some way linked to George Soros. And we can get into who George Soros is. It's I don't want to specific to this stream, but what you should know is that George Soros has a foundation, and his foundation is a think tank, and it's called the Open Society Foundation. Okay? And so I decided, well, maybe I should just do a quick search to see if Open Society Foundation has any links to Ukraine. And so I did this search earlier. There you go. The first thing, understanding Ukraine, and it's by the Open Society Foundation. That's very interesting. So you open it up, and now it's talking about the political landscape of Ukraine. This is on the foundation that's owned by George Soros, and I suspect there will be a number of... Oh, Stand With Ukraine. I wonder if this is... We're doing it live. 2014 geopolitics. Yeah, okay. So nothing too crazy right there. But so now George Soros and his Open Society Foundation have a link to Ukraine, and lo and behold, the news is about the Socialist Democrats that are in power, looking to seize more power, which is sort of sort of the premonition that you get when you watch 1984, in that those in power will start to do anything within their power to control their power and maintain their power, to include removal of rights from those who are not in power, such as the proles or the proletariat. And so when you take this in context of 1984, basically you have Poroshenko. Poroshenko was elected into office, I think, in 2014. It was somewhat recently. There's fears that he won't maintain his power, and so lo and behold, this international incident happens where there's been a treaty, there's very clear instruction on what to do, and it seems that they might not have done all that stuff. Like, nobody's really admitting that they did all that stuff. Instead, they're saying there was advanced warning. And now all of a sudden he's using that as a lever to declare martial law for at least the next 30 days in the country of Ukraine. And so all of a sudden now you have this socialist democrat taking and extending his power and creating martial law, and there's already conjecture that he might postpone the elections that are set to happen on March 31st. So again, you come up with this construct of, for socialism, the people who get into power wind up using their power to grant more power, such that they can't be removed and they can maintain their position. The warning signs should be straight out of 1984. Like, it's pretty. It seems to me that it would be clear that if you watch that, you can draw parallels to what's happening in Ukraine right now. It also seems to me that when you talk about this idea of controlling the narrative, keeping people in ignorance, and then creating war, the U.S. has been traveling along that very line for a number of years. There was an article, I think I posted maybe in last video, related to 5 of 6 big news agencies in the United States being controlled by the political left or liberals. And the outlier was Fox News. For those paying attention this year, Disney has bought out Fox News, and so their rhetoric and the way they write is starting to shift. I'm sure I'll wind up showing examples of that when we talk about critical reading, and I start that sort of series or those informational pieces. But Fox News has effectively started shifting to be more and more liberal, and they don't do this outright. Oh, my family's home. It's more of a gradual shift, and basically it's endorsing stuff that aligns with their views, and then either not saying anything or punishing views that contradict their own. So I suppose more on that later. The point here is Ukraine is following this basically narrative strand of 1984. The U.S. is starting to do that by changing free speech. You've got YouTube, Facebook removing Alex Jones, are starting to remove political people in the political right. So it's a form of censorship, as opposed to, or in addition to, the strongly controlled narrative of the political left. They're starting to remove gun rights, and so nobody wants to come after your guns, except for 4 years ago they made it so in Washington State everyone has to register their guns. Now they're making it a felony if somebody steals your gun and uses it in a crime. And then there's House Bill 5717, maybe I should cover that in the next video as well, which is the red flag law, and that's in the House of Representatives right now, or being recommended up to the House of Representatives. And basically it says anybody can flag you and say you're a potential danger, and then they come and take your guns away, at least for 72 hours. At 72 hours, that person has to prove you're a danger. Otherwise, they maintain your guns and eventually force you to sell them off unless you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you're not a danger, which, how do you prove in the negative? Like, it doesn't make any sense. But so they're starting to build this up. The other thing they're starting to do is aggrandize the idea of socialist democrats or social democracy, which doesn't wind up existing. So Ukraine is an example. Open Society Foundation is there. If you look at Brazil's an example. The person who lost the election was actually a socialist democrat. And then if you look at their party, not only was their president impeached earlier this year, but their party split like 3 times over the last 5 or 6 years due to corruption. There were a number of really big deals, like 200 million reals in Brazil's currency, that were paid into an organization that did absolutely nothing and then vanished. So again, you've got sort of this common theme of social democracy winds up being corrupt. Venezuela as well, I believe, has links into the Open Society Foundation. You can look all this up. Don't take my word for it. Please don't. So I think that wraps up what I have for this video. It sort of covers socialism and democratic socialism are the same thing. You're still talking about socialism. Nazis were actually socialists, so maybe we should stop saying Nazism is a thing of the right. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. And it's an interesting narrative, but it doesn't make any sense. NewSpeak and propaganda seems to be flourishing and becoming more and more prominent. And the problem with it is, like, how do you counter it? Well, you can say, well, they're always wrong and this is always right, but effectively you're creating this bifurcation or this binary system where there's only right and wrong. And the problem with that is then you create a reliance upon the antithetical view. If you push too far left and then you counter too far right, you wind up just as bad off. Like, realistically, you just don't ever want to be that binary. You don't want to be that divorced from the opposing party. It's better to understand and better to find the commonality or the common ground. So ideally, my videos going forward for Ready, Set, Engage won't be around they're wrong, I'm right, or they're wrong and this is right. Instead, it'll be looking at articles such as what we did today with the BBC and RT in order to look for commonality, trends, and the information that's underlying what's there. And then, of course, sometimes Wikipedia will back it up or there's other information. So that was that, 1984, great movie, highly recommend it. Telescreens, they exist. Types of government, I'll include that. I want to remove out James Fetzer for now. I'll include the election fraud. Oh, how do you fix it? So how do you fix it? If you can't go directly in contrast or in contradiction to the prevailing views, you can't attack them outright because it just makes you as bad off or as wrong as them. You can't do what the U.S. has done over the last 50 years or so with the communist and Red Scares, where there was actually sort of CIA workings to remove dissenters. I believe the best place to read about that is reading about Argentina in the 1970s. I believe 1976 or whatever, there was a bloodless revolution or something like that, and basically, like, the U.S. has been blamed for sending CIA to help remove political dissidents. So you can't do that either, especially with the narrative in the news being controlled by the left or by a party, because effectively it aggrandizes that, it turns the people against you. So the only way to really combat or to prevent or vaccinate ourselves against, one, propaganda, and two, this change to society is really through education and information. And so, again, with Ready, Set, Engage going forward, I hope to, and people can send me articles they want to talk about. I'll probably look at whatever's in the news for that day and use that as a starting point, and then we'll just sort of go through that. I'll either use Edge, or Chrome, which is what I'm using here, or Edge. In Edge, at least I'll be able to send out a link, and then it'll have all the highlights and stuff that I do as I'm talking. And so that sort of covers it, I think. Thank you so much for watching. That was Ready, Set, Engage, episode 24.